So I'm thrilled to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Richard Prather. Richard got his bachelor's in brain and cognitive sciences at MIT, and then went on to do a PhD in cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience at the University of Wisconsin. After some time as a postdoc at Indiana University, he became an assistant professor in the Department of Human Development and Quantitative Methodology at the University of Maryland, as well as in the program in neuroscience and cognitive science. Richard Prather's laboratory investigates children's neurocognitive development with a primary focus on cognitive processes relevant to early mathematics learning. The lab's theoretical approach is a complex systems view of human cognition and its context. They examine cognitive processes as dynamic systems, which also sit within a larger context. That context can include the person's math anxiety, motivation, socio-emotional skills, and even external environmental factors like low air quality. The Prather lab uses neuroimaging, computational modeling, and behavioral experimentation to develop mechanistic explanations of behavior and gain insights into the relationship between children's behavior and neural activity. In addition to laboratory-based experiments, the Prather lab also works in schools to develop interventions to improve children's mathematics performance. This important work has been published in top journals like Cognition and Developmental Science. It's received news coverage on several occasions from the Washington Post and Scientific American, and even attracted an impressive 6,000 plus following on Twitter. So today it's a great privilege for us to hear from Dr. Richard Prather about reconstructing the study of human cognition by abandoning cognitive universalism.
Thank you. I just checked to make sure my Twitter following is still at about 6,000. It is, which is fine. So thanks for having me today. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work I've been doing kind of in parallel with my kind of empirical work also. And this is stuff I've been talking about a few places this semester. And so it's been kind of constantly being updated and edited. So lucky for you, you're getting hopefully a good version because I've done this talk a couple of times. So before I begin, I'll give you some of my personal context and some acknowledgements. So, how did I kind of come to do the work that I do? It's kind of a difficult question to answer. I can come up with a story kind of post hoc. So I'm actually third generation educator. So the woman in white here is my grandmother, who is an early education major at Savannah State in the 1940s or so. So I, kind of education, early education, it's kind of the family business. And so, the way some people might sit around the dinner table talking about politics, we would sit around talking about children learning math and things going on in the schools and stuff like that, which I thought was totally normal. I thought everybody did that, but apparently that is not the case. So, I've been thinking about learning one way or another for a long time. I also want to acknowledge who is helping me do this right now. So my lab group includes a couple individuals right now. Cameron here, who is our kind of full-time research assistant, former undergraduate, just finished. Josh, who is my graduate student, he's mainly interested in executive function and math. And Lauren, our brand new postdoc, and she comes to us from Virginia State, that hasn't moved yet, so it's all Zoom meetings so far. And another thing I want to point out, which will become kind of clearer as I get into the talk, is that a lot of what I've been thinking about is kind of built on kind of a pretty interdisciplinary reading. So, kind of actively try to get outside of just kind of the typical cognitive journals and learn a bit more about approaches to working with kind of human behavior and humans in general. And that's been helped a lot from people whose work is maybe pretty different than mine, but they've offered some insight in thinking about things. So I have some of those people listed here. In particular, uh, Melina Unkofer, who is funding my work. So I have to thank her specifically. I'll talk a little bit more about the particular project that she's helping fund having to do with executive function in mathematics and how to help improve children's outcomes in those domains. So the title of the talk is kind of, slightly provocative. Um, what I'm talking about today is kind of a framework that I'm attempting to build. And in order to do that, I have to go over some of what I think are some of the major concerns people have with cognitive research. Most of these should sound somewhat familiar to you. You've probably seen publications about some of these things individually. And what I want to contend is that all these concerns are actually kind of interrelated. They're kind of pointing at some kind of single deep issue with studying human cognition that I think the field is going to need to address. And even though people have pointed out these kind of various different issues that we're trying to improve in our work, the way forward is going to be kind of bringing these things together and addressing them all at once, and basically kind of reconstructing how we think about doing cognitive research. So I think that, a lot of the ingredients for being able to do that are already there. They already exist in terms of kind of different proposals that people have made regarding these different problems or issues. But what I'm trying to do is kind of act like the conductor of the symphony here. So I'm trying to get all these groups to kind of work together and see that it's not just this kind of individual unrelated issues, but we can kind of all work through this kind of dynamically together. So to begin, start a little bit about the kind of dilemma of being someone who wants to study human cognition. What is it exactly? Who are the people who have been studying it the last, 50, 60, 70 years? And what exactly has been going on? Now, when I give this talk, I've given it to a couple of different audiences. And so some need a little bit more information about cognition than others. It's been kind of pretty interdisciplinary groups. The education people, usually want a little bit more of a conversation about exactly what cognition is. Since this is more of a cognitive group, I won't kind of go over exactly how I would define it, but I'm basically thinking of the types of researchers who may call themselves cognitive scientists or may call themselves cognitive psychologists, the types of stuff that they're interested in, things like memory, language, number. I'm not getting into things like social psychology, not because they're not interesting, but because at some point my expertise kind of wanes off and I have to kind of draw some boundaries around it and not try to take on all of psychology, which is an immensely large field. So, depending on your background, you're probably pretty familiar with some of this. If you think back kind of the history of cognitive science or cognitive psychology, starting from the cognitive revolution. And the way I want to kind of for you to think about this is you're wandering through the stacks of a library, which some of you may have not really done that in a long time. And you pull a random journal issue from some sort of cognitive journal out, flip open and see what the study is about. Forget about the topic, just think about the methods. What did you expect to see? You probably see something that's set in a lab. So we have the participants, whether it's adult college students or children, in the case of like cognitive development, come into the lab. Probably there's not a ton of space devoted to describing who the participants are. A lot of times We'll see a little bit on maybe a gender breakdown, occasionally race, but really not much else. And so for the most part, if you think about participants' context being kind of a combination of their kind of developmental history, cultural context, and societal context, for the most part, these things are ignored in kind of basic cognitive research. There are, of course, some differences if you do cross-cultural research. Obviously, that's something you pay attention to. But in what gets framed as kind of basic cognitive research that is kind of about, human cognition, for the most part, those things are kind of set aside as not being the important or relevant things. And I said to someone so earlier that a lot of times it takes the assumption that the best context is no context. And so we kind of ignore those kind of things about participants. And what you see a lot of times, although not always, so there is a little bit of individual differences work, but you'll see sometimes that, average behavior kind of reflects individuals, or average behavior reflects what is kind of going on that the researcher is interested in. So 30, 40, 50 participants do some particular task that the person is interested, and we get a sense of what the average behavior is, and may or may not really spend a lot of time thinking about the individual variation across all the participants in doing that task. So, a typical cognitive study, may include adults with little demographic information. Particularly recently, they're going to be sitting at a computer doing a task. If you're doing this across different conditions, like if you might have a setup for an ANOVA, they'll be in different conditions where there's a slight difference in the task or something like that. And the data just kind of simply compares different conditions, predicts some outcome. So I've done this type of thing many times, so I'm not saying that, no one should be doing this, but maybe it's something we should reconsider. And so, kind of what I'm arguing here is that what I really think is that people who are interested in what you would call kind of basic human cognition need to make some adjustments in what we're thinking about our focus being. What we need to do is to somewhat decenter this idea of cognition being about internal mental processes. We don't have to necessarily get rid of those things. But of course, these things interact with the participant's context. Context, of course, is very broad. It can be thought of a lot of different ways. You can think about developmental context, you can think about culture, you can think about societal context. But I really think that the kind of field of cognition needs to kind of adjust its sights so that the interaction between those two is what's at the center of what we are really studying, and not just trying to kind of isolate the internal cognitive processes without paying attention to the external context. So the main concerns that I'm going to talk about today with regards to cognitive research have to do with these four things. So these are not things that I'm coming up with. These are things that I've kind of found in the literature as seeming like things that people have been concerned with, particularly in the last 10 to 15 years. But some of these definitely go back a bit further. So one is just kind of homogeneous participant samples. So to the degree to which that we know who the participants are, it seems like we're kind of selecting from a very kind of small slice of humanity overall. Second is an issue of kind of lack of generalization of results. So things aren't generalizing necessarily as well as we would assume them to if we're trying to characterize basic cognitive processes that we think are true for all humans. How often does that actually work out? The third is ignoring extraneous variables. So, when I talk about context, there are all these variables you could collect about your participants. And it seems like the default for basic cognitive research is to ignore these things and to not think of them as extraneous, and to not try to integrate them as kind of part of the cognitive work. And the last one is, kind of mean behavior across many participants is treated as kind of generic human behavior. So the mean behavior for 30, 40, 50 participants is, almost kind of, more important than looking at the variation, looking at the spread, looking at individuals. You know, I know, of course, some people, you know, look at individual differences. There's definitely a tradition of looking at individual differences. But I contend that there could be a little bit more of that, and we can kind of push what the typical researcher does to a little bit more thinking about individual differences and variation on what they're collecting. So for the first ones, for homogeneous participant samples, this is kind of the classic kind of weird problem that gets taught in Psych 101. The issue is that many of the participants in a lot of psychology studies beyond cognitive psychology or cognitive science, but also in other areas, come from this kind of category that they describe as being kind of Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic kind of context. Related to that is just kind of this insufficient reporting of participant details. So, we may look at a study and kind of know, like if you know who the authors are, you know where they ran it, you kind of know that they got the participants from the Psych 101 pool at, some large Midwestern, university, but they don't necessarily even report a lot of information about who the participants are. And if you have time, I have some data slides kind of in the back about when you look at a typical cognitive journal, or a couple of examples of cognitive journals, even a year or two ago, take a look at what is reported for all the studies in that journal. It's just very little information about who the participants are. So I think it's kind of a problem that we don't really know a lot about who the participants are in our studies. The second one is kind of a lack of generalization of results. And this becomes an issue if we're operating on the assumption that what we are characterizing are these kind of very generalizable cognitive processes that are just kind of how humans work. So I do some study on numerical cognition, I get kind of a particular outcome, and I say, this is how people do subtraction. Not just this particular group that was in my study, but kind of broadly all people in general. We have kind of a checkered results in terms of that actually working out relatively well. I have a couple of examples of that, some being these kind of perceptual illusions that, to the degree to which you kind of see the perceptual illusions. So the example here are the two lines A and B that are actually the same length, but maybe one of them looks a little longer than the other. How well that replicates may depend on your developmental background. So where did you grow up? Did you grow up in an urban area where there are lots of straight lines because there are lots of buildings, or did you have a very different experience? So it's not necessarily that these things might kind of go away or become unimportant effects, so much as they just vary a little bit across this kind of contextual space that the actual participants vary in. And when we only kind of take participants from one small slice there, we are potentially missing out on all this kind of variation in behavior and variation in cognition that might exist. There's another example of shoes that I just kind of like because it's a little bit more kind of like motoric. And basically some researchers are interested in how people run. And apparently if you grew up somewhere where people have shoes, the way that you run looks different than people who grew up somewhere where shoes are not reliable. Like most people don't necessarily have shoes all the time. And apparently this is like, quite robust, but, the vast majority of the researchers were doing work with people who wear shoes, so they didn't quite see this difference. It's really kind of interesting. So third are the kind of extraneous variables. And the issue with the variables, I kind of see this as, how does a researcher think about what the kind of ideal experiment setup is going to be? So the common approach, I think, for a lot of cognitive people, certainly not all, is to try to set something up as elegant as possible, right? So it's kind of our idea of what we think that a really nice, well-controlled physics experiment might look like. And so, take this approach of trying to mimic what we think the natural sciences does. And, there's some issues there with like how accurate our thoughts about what the natural sciences are like actually is. But I also think the natural sciences may not be, a good kind of group to kind of strive to be like. It may just not be where we're at, or may not be the kind of the most accurate way for us to go. You can think about other areas which sometimes are also natural sciences, such as astronomy. So astronomy is a good example because you can't really set up experiments with black holes and different galaxies and things like that. They're just kind of out there. All you can do is work really hard on observing them as best you can, and knowing as much about the dynamics of how these things interact as best as you can. And maybe you find something really interesting to observe and try to figure out what's going on, but you aren't necessarily going to be able to set up a super elegant experiment of galaxy A and galaxy B and things like that. And so it could be that as people are interested in measuring humans in a lot of different ways, the situation that we are in is much more like astronomy than it is physics. And as a field, we kind of need to get over that and figure out how we can kind of create informative studies that are kind of based on that kind of approach that may seem a little bit more like astronomy. And one example I include is the use of socioeconomic status as kind of a variable you can measure about your participants. We've noted that it's been kind of increasingly popular to use that. I've seen a lot of papers in the last 10 years or so that have looked at SES differences. So it's something that's out there. People have shown differences in things like early language or early math for high SES versus low SES participants. But we're kind of stepping through these different phases of ignoring it to kind of bringing it into our work and showing differences between high and low, to maybe thinking a little bit more in a more complex way about, well, why is it there's a difference between the high and the low SES children on some simple language tasks when they're only 4 years old or something like that. That's the kind of thing, or that's the kind of progress that I'm thinking about. And back again to kind of mean behavior and thinking about treating that as generic human behavior. So one thing that kind of keeps coming up in this is that there's this idea that we're trying to describe kind of this generic human cognition. And part of how we do that is we kind of average across many individuals who might have come into our study. So we have a bunch of people who are in one particular condition. We kind of average across those and say, it looks like they all learn the thing that I want them to learn. And so we kind of talk about them in aggregate. That kind of leaves out individual variation as something that is almost kind of like treated like noise. And so, part of what I'm saying here is that, there may be some use to thinking about the individual variation, but even though we're trying to characterize cognition in this very general way, we can still do that while also talking about variation in how people are behaving in our studies. And so, one way to think about all of this is to say, is kind of mean behavior from a homogeneous sample with no context or environmental information about them useful in characterizing human cognition? Not just characterizing what those particular people are doing, but in making some general statement about how all humans think about some particular thing. The answer for that is no, it's at the bottom. So I have been working on building a proposal for kind of reconsidering, kind of reconstructing how we study human cognition. So this is part of a paper that I'm writing right now. So I'm going back and forth with the reviewers about this. So it is kind of in progress. But for the most part, what I want to kind of center this on are a couple different priorities. Now, the tricky thing here is that I don't want to be too prescriptive and saying everyone needs to do it exactly like this or exactly like that. I think there's going to be a lot of flexibility and a lot of things we're going to have to learn or kind of figure out exactly how we want to do. But I do think that it's worth considering a couple kind of big priorities in thinking about cognitive research. So the first one of those is kind of focusing on examining participants' contexts in a way that's much more consistent than what we currently do. And I break it into three different groups: developmental experiences, culture, and societal context. Now, I understand that each of these is incredibly complex and rich. So it's not like you can kind of casually do this thoroughly for every single participants you have. But part of the reason why I bring this up is because you can see where there are many different ways that context might be relevant for your particular study. And there are lots of aspects of context for your participants that you could focus on. I don't expect that everyone's going to be able to do everything in each study. Part of me kind of thinking about these three different things is thinking that, over time, over many different studies, you could imagine different researchers might focus on different aspects of context. And we can kind of hopefully create a way where we can kind of build on each other's work in a way that's a little more consistent. And I think some things that have changed relatively recently, let's say in the last 15, 20 years, particularly around data sharing, can make that a lot more possible than it might have been in 1985 or something like that. So there's going to be many ways to potentially integrate these factors. I like to go back to socioeconomic status as an example. When I teach my cognitive development class, I actually talk to students a lot about the use of SES in a lot of these kind of cognitive development work. And you can kind of see it if you go through the studies chronologically. At first, there's really no SES information. Like, you could have a study that's done in a well-known upper middle class suburb, and they say all the parents were local parents, but they won't really say explicitly all the participants were high SES. And so, at first you didn't really get any of that information. Then at some point, you got people kind of comparing high SES and low SES, saying, oh, the high SES children are learning their words faster. The low SES children aren't learning as many words, and those kind of comparisons. What I would move to, which a few researchers kind of have made the move, is to think a little bit more in a more complex way about, okay, what's the variation in their environment, in their context, that just seems to correlate with being high SES versus low SES? Like, SES is a construct we're kind of creating, but there are a lot of things about the child's environment that might vary across those things. And how can we measure what those things are, talk about them in our study, and integrate that with kind of our theory of how they are learning to do the thing that we are interested in? So one potential example is noise. So in some cities, people in low SES households are more likely to live somewhere that is just noisy, and that has consequences for early language learning. Another example from my own work that we're working on right now is air pollution. So we are looking at the effects of air pollution on children's early math learning. There's a lot of work with animals showing that air pollution is bad for you, or bad for the animals, certainly. And they don't do as well on the little, mazes and things like that when they've been exposed to air pollution in the lab. We assume that is the case for humans also. There's a lot of high-level work that looks at things like developmental outcomes, like graduating from high school, things like that, clearly showing if you grow up in an area where there's relatively high pollution, you're less likely to do things like graduate from high school. What we're trying to do is something kind of in the middle in terms of the level analysis, which is look at things like EEG recordings for children who are either in relatively high air pollution areas versus low air pollution areas, and think about how that kind of interacts with their cognitive outcomes. So, I use myself as an example here where I've kind of broadened my scope of analysis here. So I have a collaborator in public health who is on the project. Air pollution is not something I know anything about. But instead of just kind of looking at what I think is kind of going on in the kids' heads with regarding to the mental processes involved in number, and broadening the scope analysis to involve a significant chunk of their external context. We're not doing everything. It's actually quite complicated, particularly these days. And we only have so much time with the participants, so there's only so many things that we can measure or ask the parents about. And so, there's a lot of back and forth thinking about, you know, how much is gained from getting certain information for the participants versus how long is it going to take them to do, and they're not going to actually want to sit down and do all these things. So, from my own perspective in trying to do this, I can tell you it's not trivial to try to integrate large amounts of the kind of external context from participants. But I do think it makes for a much more interesting and useful study. The second thing here, which probably plays well here, is to embrace complexity. And my main beef here is that I think kind of elegance is might be somewhat overrated in terms of thinking about how we structure these studies. Um, what we're trying to actually characterize, if you think about kind of cognitive processes or cognition as part of a large complex system that in part involves the person, but also involves the context that they're interacting with, using this kind of reductionist, trying to control things, controlling framework might not be the best way of going at it. And so in thinking about things like the statistical methods we are using, what kinds of things are more common, we made it think about using different approaches that are than what is common right now. And the example I kind of give there is, when you're looking at many variables, looking at kind of a very messy system that you don't really have control over. I'm actually in the College of Education at Maryland, and I interact with a lot of people who work in education at kind of a different level analysis, and they get these huge data sets from these nationally representative examples, and they're just doing all sorts of like path analysis and structural equation modeling, and they're like, well, how else would you do it, And that seems like very common in their world, but at some point, as you kind of go down the level of analysis and get something a little closer to cognitive work or like educational psychology, then it's like put the people into groups and do an ANOVA comparison. And so, I think that, particularly if people are trying to collect more data about the participants' context and demographics, it may be worth kind of revisiting, thinking through what kind of statistical approaches might be useful and interesting. So I'm not saying that everyone should do structural equation modeling. At first I kind of was, but then the statistician who was on my grant said, actually, that's not what we need to be doing. So we're doing something slightly different. But that's what I'm talking about. That's kind of useful to talk to someone who knows these tools a little bit better, and you can kind of go back and forth about kind of how we think about the problem and kind of what tool would be useful. The third one here is a little more complicated. So in developing this framework over the course of a couple of years, I would say, one thing I've been a little bit interested in is intersectionality. Now, my personal impression of what that was that I really associated it with kind of qualitative work, right? So I was thinking about like qualitative sociology, kind of ethnography kind of thing. Didn't quite kind of really see where it was relevant to doing basic cognitive work. I have seen recently in other social sciences, people have been trying to bring in kind of an intersectional framework to their own areas. I've seen it in a couple of areas of psychology and in public health also, which is kind of an interesting area to read. And I, fortunately stumbled upon some work done by Nicole Elsie Quest and Janet Hyde pretty recently, 2016. They have a pair of papers on what they frame quantitative intersectionality. So thinking about how intersectional framework can be used using quantitative approaches. They're very good papers. They're also very dense. I can't say that I can kind of give you a 10-second explanation. So for the most part, what I want to do is simply kind of suggest that people take a look at these papers. You'll recognize a lot of what they're talking about, because a lot of what they're talking about is almost just about interaction effects between things, and not just looking at kind of main effects, but really thinking about the intersection, hence intersectionality. And the last thing here is to more explicitly consider constraints on generality. So it seems like the current default is, whatever as you kind of get in your study, whatever results are, this is kind of how cognition works, right? You just kind of simply say, we found that participants did X, Y, Z. This is it. This is, number cognition. And to some degree, everyone has kind of a limitation section they have to talk about a little bit. But there have been, a couple of recent papers that have really called to suggest that we need to talk a little more explicitly and a little more thoroughly about what the constraints on generality are for the particular study. I think this also kind of gets into what I was previously talking about, context, where if we characterize who the participants are in a much more thorough way, then we can talk about why this particular sample might behave in a way that's different from another sample, right? So if you don't know if your participants are high SES or not, then you can't really talk about whether or not it's going to generalize to high or low SES participants, because you just haven't looked at that information. So even if you have kind of a restriction on your sample, or maybe your sample isn't as representative as you could like, you could at least say, okay, we have, very high SES participants here. It might not be the case that this is going to generalize exactly to a group that is different than that. And at the very least, you can kind of put that in the paper, kind of have that out there for the next researcher who comes along. If they have a different sample and they get a different result than you do, then we can kind of put those together and kind of it makes sense potentially. So we can see a difference in the context of the participants and a different in the kind of behavioral result. And then that kind of potentially can still work together and not just be kind of a failure to replicate, where we don't really know if we were sampling from the same participants or not. So I'm kind of using myself as an example of implementing this. So in my current work that's ongoing, we're attempting to actually do this relatively well. It's tricky. So the study that we're starting up looks at executive function and how it supports math learning. So this is the one that's funded through the EF Plus Math program. We're specifically looking at African-American children from 3rd through 5th grade. The main cognitive outcome are a couple of different math tasks that we've picked out. We're interested in number line, fractions, because everyone loves fractions, and equivalence problems. We're also looking at executive function. Aaron Buss, who is a kind of dynamic systems modeler who specializes in executive function, is collaborating with us. So we're not just looking at executive function as kind of a single thing, but kind of breaking it down into several different components. And what we're trying to do with, kind of additional context for the participant is kind of getting as much information as we possibly can. This was written up and planned pre-COVID. So I had a whole kind of interview that we're going to be doing in person. If you ever worked with children, in person works a lot better than online. You're just getting more information from them. It's easier to get them more comfortable. So we're kind of, trying something new in working on this online, but we're trying to get much more thorough kind of demographics about who the participants are, learning something about their home environment and their school environment. So eventually this is going to go into the schools once those are open again. And in that case, the context that we're going to be getting information on is about their classroom. So we're working with teachers. We're going to be trying to get information about the kids' peer group, things like that. All of these are things that we know, particularly from education research, can influence how well they are doing on these math tasks. But a lot of this work gets done kind of piecemeal. It's either one thing or another. What we're trying to do is put all of it together in one large quantitative model of their kind of cognitive outcomes as it relates to math. So it's going to be complicated, but it involves collecting a lot of different data and trying to kind of model it all in one way. And, working on the model, that's an ongoing process. The idea here is that we're sort of going to have a two-part model. At one level analysis, kind of a high level analysis, is something more akin to like a path model, like you would see here. It's kind of a mess. It doesn't look as elegant as they always look in the papers. But you can imagine there's some kind of like cognitive task outcome, like the fraction task. And you're trying to relate all these different variables that you've collected in a particular way to that outcome. So you would look at things like parent income or their assessment of what their peers are like. Do their peers like math or not like math? Things about the individual like math anxiety, or we can get to things like kind of frustration tolerance and think about how can I create kind of a large model that kind of predicts the outcome. In addition to that, we're doing kind of like a lower level analysis that is essentially kind of a dynamic systems model of how we think the task is working, right? So we get these variables about who the participants are and their context. We also get specific information about how well they're doing on the fraction task. We can kind of put that into kind of a dynamic systems model to predict how these kind of external context variables might affect how they are doing on the actual task. So think about something like math anxiety. You'd expect math anxiety might have a direct effect on how well you're doing in fractions because nobody likes fractions, right? And so you could see that, that for a participant who says that they have high math anxiety, maybe that's going to affect them on the fraction task specifically, and maybe less so on other kind of math tasks. So essentially what we're trying to do is kind of hook up two different kind of computational models or kind of mathematical models that kind of operate on different levels of analysis and see if we can come up with a way to think about all these things together at one time, whether it's about what level of discrimination they feel in the classroom, whether it's about how well they're doing executive function. We know that all these things kind of matter to each other. And a teacher, an educator can kind of think about these things too. A teacher sees when a child suddenly starts performing poorly, it's not necessarily that they kind of, unlearn the material that they previously knew. It could be that there's some sort of external stressor or external context that is affecting their behavior on that day. What we're trying to do is get that all into a model. So I think there are a lot of benefits to this approach. I think it does help with kind of better connections with other disciplines because we're talking more about all these other aspects of behavior and kind of social systems that we know are important. I do think that in the long term, the results are going to be more accurate and more likely to be useful for us and more likely to have kind of clear applications to areas such as education. There are, some difficulties as you solve with that path analysis. Doing things this way is going to be complicated. We've seen in our own study that just coming up with an idea of exactly what we want to measure about the participant's context, finding a way to do that doesn't take 5 hours for the participant because they're not going to sit for 5 hours for your study, is complicated. Fortunately, there's a lot of work out there for measuring a lot of these things. And we're trying to pick things that are relatively fast and relatively straightforward, but it's always tricky. One potential issue that a few people have brought up is, well, maybe the study results are less certain. So you have this study and you kind of couch it with, well, my participants were these people and they were kind of like this, and so maybe I don't really know. And I think that that's fine. I think that it's going to be kind of more accurate in the long term for us to be upfront about those kind of things and try to build on it over time, rather than simply saying, I think this is how it is, and let's kind of generalize, across all humans. There are going to be some issues with context, in the sense that you're not going to be able to measure everything. So for any study, no matter how hard you work in measuring the context that you think is relevant, reviewer can come in and say, why didn't you measure this other thing? I bet that other thing was the important thing. It's already kind of like that in publishing. So I don't think this is actually going to make things harder. It's just saying, there's always going to be limitations. You can't measure everything in one study. There's always going to be kind of that extra thing that could be something that is relevant. And the last one is, is this really kind of cognition? So as I think I said before, I really think we need to kind of push the focus from exclusively being on the internal processes to being at the kind of interaction between the internal mental processes and the external context. Because we know cognition doesn't happen in a vacuum. There are no humans who are living in a vacuum. And since it is always the case that humans are embedded in some sort of developmental, cultural, or societal context, our best bet as researchers is to just try to measure that as best we can and integrate that in our theories of what cognition is. It's going to be tricky, it's going to be kind of messy, but I think kind of in the long term, that's going to be our best bet as a field. So in conclusion, I'll kind of reiterate the 4 recommendations I had. And in on this, which, maybe everyone agrees with, maybe not. But we want to focus on the dynamic interaction between individual and their environment. And we also want to make sure that in considering individual differences, we simultaneously attend to differences in context. If we don't do that, it's going to be fundamentally inadequate. We need to be able to bring in all these things together at once as much as possible. And with that, thank you.